The first-class cabin fell silent the moment Captain Daniel Harris stopped beside seat 2A. The boarding process had been smooth until then. Flight attendants greeted passengers with practiced smiles while the soft glow of overhead lights reflected off polished leather seats. Outside the aircraft windows, the early morning sun painted the runway in shades of gold, promising another routine departure from New York to San Francisco. Victoria Carter sat quietly by the window, dressed in a simple navy blazer, dark jeans, and white sneakers. Her leather tote rested neatly beneath the seat in front of her. There were no designer logos, no expensive jewelry, nothing that announced wealth or status. She looked like any professional traveler hoping to enjoy a peaceful flight. Captain Harris glanced briefly at the boarding pass in her hand before looking back at her face. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said in a firm, practiced tone. "I believe you're in the wrong cabin." Victoria looked up calmly. "My boarding pass says seat 2A. "I understand," he replied, his smile growing thinner. "There must have been a mistake at the gate." She handed him the pass without another word. He examined it. Seat 2A. First class. Everything appeared valid. Yet something inside him insisted it couldn't be right. Around them, conversations slowed as nearby passengers sensed the tension. A businessman lowered his newspaper. A young couple exchanged uncertain glances. Even Emma Collins, the lead flight attendant standing several rows away, noticed the conversation lasting far longer than usual. Captain Harris returned the boarding pass. "I'm going to ask you to step off the aircraft while we verify your ticket." Victoria didn't move. "Has there been a problem with the reservation? I just need you to cooperate." His voice remained professional, but the underlying message was unmistakable. "You don't belong here." Emma walked over carefully. "Captain, I checked the manifest earlier. Seat 2A is assigned. I'll handle this, Emma." She stopped speaking. Victoria studied the captain's face for a long second. There was no anger in his eyes. No personal hostility. Only absolute certainty. The certainty that he already knew who belonged in first class. And who did not. "I purchased this ticket weeks ago," Victoria said quietly. "I understand. I checked in without issue." "I'm sure you did. So why am I being asked to leave?" Captain Harris hesitated just long enough for everyone nearby to notice. "We need to complete an additional verification." The explanation sounded official, but it answered nothing. A woman across the aisle frowned. "Her boarding pass looks fine." Another passenger whispered, "Why is she the only one being questioned?" Emma shifted uncomfortably. She had worked with Captain Harris for nearly 6 years. He was respected throughout the airline for his discipline and professionalism. But today, something felt wrong. Victoria slowly stood. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply picked up her tote bag. "I don't want to delay the flight," she said. Her calmness made the silence even heavier. As she walked toward the front exit, dozens of eyes followed her. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked confused. No one spoke. Captain Harris believed the situation was over. He had prevented what he assumed was a boarding error. He turned to Emma. "Let's finish boarding." Emma nodded, though uneasily. Just before Victoria reached the aircraft door, she paused. She looked back at the first-class cabin one final time. Not with anger. Not with humiliation. Only quiet disappointment. Then she stepped off the aircraft without another word. Captain Harris watched her disappear into the jet bridge. He had no idea that the woman he had just removed from first class wasn't simply a passenger. Within the next few hours, she would walk into the airline's executive headquarters. Not as a customer. Not as a guest. But as the newly appointed CEO of SkyBridge Airways. And the decision he had made in front of an entire cabin was about to become the most unforgettable lesson of his 25-year career. Victoria Carter had spent most of her life walking into rooms where people underestimated her before she ever spoke. It had happened in classrooms where teachers assumed she needed extra help before seeing the perfect grades she quietly earned. It had happened in boardrooms where clients looked past her and addressed the nearest white executive instead. It had happened in luxury hotels where receptionists politely asked if she was checking in as someone's assistant rather than the guest who had reserved the presidential suite. She had learned long ago that prejudice rarely announced itself with cruelty. More often, it arrived disguised as certainty. By the time she reached 38, Victoria no longer wasted energy trying to prove strangers wrong. Success had taught her that character always outlasted first impressions. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, she had watched her mother work double shifts as a flight attendant while her father repaired aircraft engines at a regional airport. Neither of them ever earned large salaries, but they believed deeply in one simple principle. Respect every person before you know their story. Those words became the foundation of Victoria's life. As a little girl, she often waited after school inside the maintenance hangar where her father worked. She loved watching enormous airplanes being prepared for another journey. To everyone else, they were machines carrying passengers from one city to another. To Victoria, they represented opportunity. Her father would point toward the runway and smile. "Every plane carries people with dreams," he would tell her. Never forget that. Those memories stayed with her long after she earned a scholarship to one of the country's top business schools. She graduated at the top of her class. She built a reputation rescuing struggling transportation companies through careful planning instead of flashy speeches. Investors admired her discipline. Employees admired her honesty. Competitors respected her ability to solve problems without creating unnecessary conflict. Yet, despite becoming one of the youngest executives in the aviation industry, Victoria refused to surround herself with symbols of power. She drove her own car. She carried the same leather tote for nearly a decade. She flew commercial whenever possible. And she insisted on introducing herself simply as Victoria. When SkyBridge Airways offered her the position of Chief Executive Officer, many industry analysts questioned the decision. Some doubted whether someone with her background could transform an airline facing declining customer satisfaction and growing financial pressure. Victoria never responded publicly. Instead, she spent her first weeks reading thousands of customer complaints. Delayed flights. Poor communication. Employees afraid to challenge bad decisions. Passengers feeling invisible. The reports revealed numbers. But Victoria wanted something more valuable. She wanted truth. That was why she rejected the company's offer to announce her arrival with a press conference or executive tour. Very few employees had actually met the new CEO. Even fewer knew what she looked like. Instead, she created a different plan. She booked an ordinary commercial ticket on one of SkyBridge's busiest cross-country routes. No security team. No executive assistants. No photographers. Only a quiet opportunity to experience the airline exactly as every customer did. She wanted to observe the crew without influencing their behavior. To see how passengers were treated when no executives appeared to be watching. As her driver pulled into the airport that morning, Victoria switched off her phone and slipped it into her tote bag. For the next several hours, she wasn't the woman whose signature would shape the future of a billion-dollar airline. She was simply another traveler hoping to reach her destination. She smiled politely at the gate agent, thanked the baggage handler, held the terminal door open for an elderly couple. No one recognized her. That was exactly how she wanted it. She believed the strongest leaders learned more by listening than by announcing themselves. But she never imagined that before the aircraft even left the gate, her quiet inspection would become something far greater than a routine evaluation. It would expose a hidden weakness inside the airline's culture, one that no financial report, customer survey, or executive meeting had ever revealed. And it all began with one assumption made by a man who believed he could recognize who belonged in first class simply by looking at them. Captain Daniel Harris had built a career on making decisions that left no room for hesitation. For more than 25 years, he had flown through violent storms, mechanical emergencies, and countless unexpected situations that demanded absolute confidence. Thousands of passengers had trusted him with their lives, and he had never betrayed that trust. His record was nearly flawless, earning him the reputation of being one of SkyBridge Airways' most respected captains. Inside the company, younger pilots admired him. Managers relied on him. Flight attendants knew he expected perfection. To Daniel, Aviation was more than a profession. It was an environment where discipline preserved lives, where instinct was sharpened by decades of experience, and where second-guessing could become dangerous. Unfortunately, those instincts had slowly expanded beyond the cockpit. Over the years, he began believing his first impressions were almost always correct. He could supposedly recognize nervous passengers before takeoff. He believed he could predict who would complain during a delay. He even claimed he could identify travelers who had somehow boarded with incorrect seat assignments before anyone scanned a boarding pass. Most of the time, no one challenged him. His confidence made people assume he was right. That confidence also shaped the culture around him. Emma Collins had worked as his lead flight attendant for 6 years. She respected his professionalism and admired the calm authority he displayed during emergencies. Yet, she had also noticed another side of him, one that rarely appeared in official performance reports. Sometimes Captain Harris judged people before speaking to them. He occasionally treated wealthy frequent flyers with unusual warmth while becoming noticeably colder toward passengers who looked less affluent. The differences were subtle. Never rude enough to generate formal complaints. Never obvious enough for human resources to investigate. But Emma had seen them. She remembered an elderly janitor traveling to visit his granddaughter. Captain Harris had questioned his first-class upgrade twice before accepting the manifest. She remembered a young Latino entrepreneur who had been asked if he needed help finding the economy cabin despite holding a business-class ticket. Each incident seemed small on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. Emma had considered mentioning her concerns before. But Daniel's reputation carried enormous weight inside the airline. Who would believe a flight attendant over one of the company's most decorated captains? That morning, as Victoria quietly left the aircraft carrying only her leather tote, Emma felt something inside her tighten. The silence in the cabin lingered even after the boarding door closed again. Several passengers continued glancing toward the empty seat in 2A. A middle-aged woman leaned toward her husband. "I don't think that was right." Her husband nodded without taking his eyes off the window. It didn't feel like a ticket issue. Near the front galley, Emma reviewed the electronic passenger manifest one more time. Seat 2A. Victoria Carter. Confirmed. Paid in full. No alerts. No seating errors. No security flags. Everything was exactly as it should have been. She took a slow breath before approaching the cockpit. "Captain." Daniel looked up from the flight management system. "What is it?" "I checked the reservation again. And? There wasn't any mistake." He barely looked away from his instruments. "I know." Emma hesitated. "Then, why was she removed?" Daniel leaned back in his seat. His answer came without anger. Without hesitation. Sometimes experience tells you things paperwork doesn't. Emma frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I've flown long enough to recognize when something doesn't add up." He folded his arms. "People end up in the wrong cabins more often than you'd think." "But her ticket, Emma." His tone remained calm, but final. "The matter is closed." She lowered her eyes. "Yes, Captain." As she walked back toward the galley, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing inside her. For the first time in 6 years, she wondered whether experience had become something more dangerous. Not wisdom, not confidence, but certainty without evidence. Meanwhile, several floors below the departure gate, Victoria Carter stepped into a private airport conference room reserved for SkyBridge executives. Waiting for her was the airline's chairman, members of the board, and the leadership team responsible for introducing the company's new CEO. No one in the cockpit knew where she had gone. No one knew the quiet woman who had left first class without protest was now preparing to lead the very airline whose values had just been tested. And before the day was over, Captain Daniel Harris would find himself standing before the same woman, not as the pilot in command, but as an employee facing the person who now held the highest authority in SkyBridge Airways. Most people believed real power revealed itself through loud voices, sharp commands, or public victories. Victoria Carter had learned the opposite. The strongest people were often the quietest. As she stepped off Flight 287 and into the jet bridge, the cool morning air replaced the warmth of the first-class cabin. Behind her, The aircraft door closed with a metallic thud, sealing away the whispers, the awkward stares, and the uncomfortable silence she had left behind. She paused for only a moment, not because she felt defeated, but because she wanted to understand what had just happened. She replayed every second in her mind. Captain Harris had never shouted. He had never insulted her. He had spoken politely, professionally. Yet beneath every carefully chosen word had been an unmistakable assumption that she simply didn't belong. Victoria had encountered that assumption countless times throughout her life. Sometimes it came from strangers. Sometimes from business partners. Occasionally even from people who genuinely believed they were being fair. Prejudice rarely wore an angry face. More often, it smiled politely while quietly closing doors. She took a slow breath before walking toward a private elevator reserved for SkyBridge executives. The security officer standing nearby smiled warmly. "Good morning, Ms. Carter." "Good morning, James." He pressed the elevator button immediately. "No one upstairs knows you've arrived yet." Victoria nodded. "Let's keep it that way." "Of course." As the elevator doors closed, she looked once more toward the windows overlooking the runway. Flight 287 was beginning to taxi. Captain Harris had already returned to his cockpit, completely unaware that the woman he had removed from first class was now heading toward the executive floor. Back inside the aircraft, Emma Collins couldn't stop thinking about the empty seat. First-class service had begun. Champagne glasses were being prepared. Breakfast orders were taken. But seat 2A remained vacant. Its untouched blanket and folded menu seemed almost symbolic, reminding everyone that someone should have been sitting there. A businessman seated across the aisle quietly asked Emma, "Will the passenger be coming back?" Emma forced a professional smile. "I'm afraid I don't know, sir." He nodded slowly. "That's unfortunate." Another passenger leaned forward. "I've flown every week for 10 years. This doesn't feel like your airline." His words lingered long after Emma walked away. For the first time in years, she found herself questioning not just one decision, but an entire culture of silence. She had known something wasn't right, yet she had obeyed. Because challenging the captain wasn't how things were done. Because experience always outranked intuition. Or so everyone believed. Meanwhile, on the top floor of SkyBridge Airways headquarters, executives hurried through glass hallways carrying presentation folders and tablets. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Today marked the official introduction of the company's new chief executive officer. No reporters had been invited. No public announcement had been released. Only senior leadership knew who would be walking into the boardroom. The chairman stood near the panoramic windows overlooking the airport. He checked his watch. "Has Ms. Carter arrived?" His assistant smiled. "She just entered the building." "Excellent." He glanced around the room. "I hope everyone is ready." None of them realized that only 15 minutes earlier, their new CEO had been quietly escorted off one of the company's own aircraft. Victoria entered the executive lounge without mentioning the incident. Several board members greeted her warmly. "It's wonderful to finally meet you. We've heard remarkable things. The company is fortunate to have your leadership." She thanked each of them with the same calm smile she had worn throughout the morning. No one noticed the boarding pass still tucked inside her leather tote. No one asked how her flight had gone. She didn't volunteer the story. Not yet. Instead, she requested one simple item before the meeting officially began. "I'd like the complete crew report for Flight 287. The chairman looked mildly surprised. "Certainly. Is there a particular reason?" Victoria smiled gently. "I believe every company's culture is revealed by its ordinary moments. Today," she rested her hand lightly on the conference table, "I witnessed one worth understanding." Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Flight 287 climbed steadily through the clouds toward California. Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Harris believed he had already forgotten the quiet woman from seat 2A. He couldn't have been more mistaken. By the time his aircraft landed, the woman he had dismissed without ever truly seeing would be waiting, not with anger, not with revenge, but with a lesson powerful enough to reshape the future of SkyBridge Airways forever. Flight 287 landed in San Francisco exactly on schedule. Captain Daniel Harris felt a familiar sense of satisfaction as the aircraft rolled smoothly toward the gate. Another flawless landing. Another routine flight completed without turbulence or technical issues. Inside the cockpit, he exchanged a brief smile with his first officer. "Nice and easy," the younger pilot said. Daniel nodded as he completed the shutdown checklist. Just the way passengers like it. He believed the day had unfolded exactly as it should. The incident before departure had barely crossed his mind since takeoff. In his experience, difficult boarding situations happened occasionally. Once they were resolved, everyone simply moved on. Or so he thought. As passengers began leaving the aircraft, Emma Collins stood near the exit, thanking each traveler with her usual warmth. "Thank you for flying with SkyBridge. Have a wonderful afternoon." Most passengers smiled politely. A few did not. The businessman from seat 3A paused before stepping into the jet bridge. "I've flown with this airline for 15 years. Emma looked at him. "I hope we met your expectations today, sir." He hesitated. "I think your crew should remember that respect matters just as much as safety." Before she could answer, he quietly walked away. Moments later, the elderly woman from row 2 stopped beside Emma. "I've raised 3 sons. I always told them that the way they treat people they don't know says more about them than anything else." She gently squeezed Emma's hand. "I hope someone remembers that." Emma watched her disappear into the crowd. The comments weren't angry. They were disappointed. Somehow, that felt much worse. Inside the cockpit, Captain Harris finished organizing his flight documents when his company tablet vibrated. "Priority message, please report immediately to Executive Conference Room A upon arrival. Attendance required for all members of Flight 287 crew, ****. Daniel frowned. Executive Conference Room? That was unusual. He opened the message again. No explanation. No agenda. Only one sentence stood out. Mandatory attendance. His first officer looked over. "Everything okay?" Daniel shrugged. "Probably another operational review." Emma entered the cockpit a few moments later. "I received the same message." Daniel smiled confidently. "Don't worry. It's probably about next month's service initiative." Emma wanted to believe him. Yet something deep inside told her otherwise. 45 minutes later, the Flight 287 crew walked through the glass corridors of SkyBridge Airways headquarters. The executive floor was unlike any part of the company most employees ever visited. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the airport. Modern artwork lined the walls. Employees spoke quietly as they hurried between conference rooms. The atmosphere felt calm, almost ceremonial. Emma noticed several senior executives standing outside the largest boardroom. They weren't chatting casually. They were waiting, one by one, almost as if expecting someone important. Daniel adjusted his pilot's jacket. "This seems more formal than I expected." Before anyone could respond, the chairman's executive assistant approached them. "Captain Harris?" "Yes. The board will see your crew in just a few minutes." Daniel smiled politely. "May I ask what this meeting concerns?" "I'm afraid the chairman would prefer to explain personally." She offered a courteous smile before walking away. Emma exchanged a nervous glance with another flight attendant. No one spoke. The silence felt heavier with every passing minute. Inside Conference Room A, final preparations were underway. Fresh coffee had been placed on the long walnut table. Presentation screens glowed softly. Board members quietly reviewed briefing folders. At the head of the table stood an empty chair, reserved for only one person, the new chief executive officer. The chairman checked his watch. "Is Ms. Carter ready?" His assistant nodded. "She's reviewing one final document." "What document?" "The crew report from Flight 287. The chairman looked mildly surprised. "So soon?" She requested it immediately after arriving. He slowly closed his folder. "Interesting." Outside the conference room, Captain Harris straightened his tie. He had attended dozens of executive meetings throughout his career. Award ceremonies, safety reviews, leadership conferences. Never once had he felt uncertain walking into one. Today was different. He couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was Emma's unusual silence. Perhaps it was the expressions on the executives' faces. Or perhaps it was the strange feeling that something invisible had already been decided long before he arrived. The conference room doors began to open. The chairman stepped into the hallway with a welcoming smile. "Captain Harris, Emma, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming." He gestured toward the boardroom. "Our new CEO is waiting for you." Daniel nodded confidently and walked inside. The moment his eyes reached the head of the table, every confident thought vanished. Sitting calmly beneath the SkyBridge Airways logo was the same woman he had ordered out of first class only hours earlier. Victoria Carter looked up from the crew report. She met his eyes with perfect composure. "Good afternoon, Captain Harris. Please, have a seat." For the first time in 25 years of flying, Daniel Harris felt the ground beneath him disappear. For several long seconds, no one in the conference room moved. Captain Daniel Harris remained standing just inside the doorway, his hand still resting on the polished brass handle. His heartbeat seemed louder than the quiet hum of the air conditioning, and every conversation that had filled the hallway moments earlier had vanished into complete silence. At the far end of the walnut conference table sat Victoria Carter. She wore the same navy blazer, the same white blouse, the same calm expression she had worn when he asked her to leave first class. Only one thing had changed. Now she occupied the chair reserved for the Chief Executive Officer of SkyBridge Airways. The company logo stretched across the wall behind her, illuminated by soft white lights that reflected against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the airport. Aircraft taxied across the runways below, appearing almost weightless beneath the afternoon sun. Daniel felt his mouth go dry. His first instinct was disbelief. There had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding. But the expressions around the room erased every possibility. Board members stood respectfully as Victoria closed the folder resting in front of her. The chairman smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said warmly, "allow me to formally introduce the new Chief Executive Officer of SkyBridge Airways." He turned toward Victoria. "Ms. Victoria Carter." The room filled with polite applause. Emma Collins slowly lowered her eyes. Everything suddenly made sense. The empty seat, the executive summons, the crew report. Victoria had never been an ordinary passenger. She had been quietly evaluating the airline from the moment she entered the terminal. Daniel felt as though the air had disappeared from the room. Every confident assumption he had carried that morning now echoed back with painful clarity. Asterisk, sometimes experience tells you things paperwork doesn't. Asterisk, the words replayed in his mind like a recording he wished he could erase. Victoria rose gracefully from her chair. She looked first at the board members, then at the Flight 287 crew. Finally, her eyes rested on Captain Harris. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no trace of revenge, only composure. "Good afternoon," she said softly. "Please, everyone have a seat." Her voice was calm enough to lower the tension in the room, yet no one could ignore the weight carried by those simple words. Chairs slid quietly across the polished floor. Daniel sat down more slowly than anyone else. For the first time in decades, he felt uncertain inside a room. Victoria remained standing. "I appreciate all of you taking the time to meet with me today." She paused briefly. "When I accepted the responsibility of leading this airline, I promised our board that my first priority would not be profit." Several executives exchanged curious glances. "My first priority," she continued, "would be trust." She walked slowly beside the conference table. "Our passengers trust us with their safety. Our employees trust us with their careers. Our communities trust us with their families." She stopped beside the panoramic window overlooking the runway. "But trust is built long before an aircraft leaves the ground." No one interrupted. Outside, another SkyBridge aircraft lifted gracefully into the afternoon sky. Victoria watched it for a moment before turning back toward the room. "This morning, I experienced our airline exactly as one of our customers would." Her eyes met Daniel's. "I wasn't looking for perfection. I wasn't expecting flawless service. I simply wanted to understand how people are treated when no one believes they're being observed." Daniel lowered his gaze. Every sentence felt heavier than the last. Victoria never raised her voice. She never mentioned first class. She never accused anyone. That restraint somehow made the room even more uncomfortable. Emma glanced toward Captain Harris. The man she had admired for years now looked completely different. Not because he had lost his authority, but because he had finally seen the consequences of certainty without compassion. Victoria returned to the head of the table. She gently placed one hand on the crew report lying before her. This document contains flight times, fuel consumption, operational procedures, and service records. She looked around the room. But it doesn't record the most important part of today's flight. She allowed the silence to settle. How one passenger was made to feel. No one spoke. Not even the chairman. The quiet became more powerful than any accusation ever could. Victoria finally offered a small, sincere smile. I believe every mistake can become a lesson. And today, she looked directly at Captain Harris. We all have something important to learn. If this moment touched your heart, remember this. True leadership begins with respect, not assumptions. The silence in the boardroom lingered long after Victoria Carter finished speaking. No one reached for a notebook. No one checked a phone. Even the executives who had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar contracts seemed reluctant to disturb the stillness. Captain Daniel Harris sat perfectly still. His hands, which had remained steady through lightning storms and emergency landings, now rested uneasily on the conference table. For the first time in his career, he realized that the greatest mistake he had ever made had not happened in the air. It had happened before the aircraft ever left the gate. Victoria slowly opened the folder in front of her. I'd like to share something with all of you. She removed a single boarding pass. The edges were slightly creased from being folded into her leather tote. This, she said, holding it gently between her fingers, is my boarding pass for Flight 287. She placed it carefully on the table. Seat 2A. Purchased 3 weeks ago. Verified at check-in. Verified again at security. She looked around the room. And still, she paused. I was asked to leave the aircraft. No one challenged the statement. No one could. Every detail had already been confirmed. Victoria continued calmly. I want to be absolutely clear. I was not embarrassed because I lost a seat. She looked toward the board members. I've flown enough to know operational mistakes happen. I wasn't upset because someone questioned a boarding pass. She turned her attention to the Flight 287 crew. I was saddened because no one questioned the assumption behind the decision. Emma felt her chest tighten. Victoria wasn't pointing at one individual. She was describing an entire culture. A culture where authority had quietly replaced curiosity. Where certainty had become stronger than evidence. Victoria folded her hands together. When Captain Harris approached me this morning, I noticed something. She smiled gently, not mockingly, but thoughtfully. He never asked me where I was traveling. He never asked whether there had been a reservation error. He never called customer service. He had already decided who I was. The words landed with quiet precision. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. Every sentence was true. He had relied on instinct instead of facts. Appearance instead of verification. Assumption instead of conversation. Victoria looked directly at him. Captain Harris. Her voice remained kind. I've read your record. You've safely carried hundreds of thousands of passengers. You've trained young pilots. You've represented this airline with professionalism for decades. Daniel looked up surprised. She wasn't listing his failures. She was acknowledging his achievements. And that, Victoria continued, is exactly why this matters. The room remained silent. When someone with your reputation makes a decision, others rarely question it. She glanced briefly toward Emma. They assume your judgment must be correct. She returned her eyes to Daniel. Leadership is powerful. So are assumptions. The distinctions settled heavily over the room. Victoria walked slowly toward the panoramic windows. Outside, baggage crews loaded another aircraft while families embraced near the terminal below. They all look different. They come from different neighborhoods. They speak different languages. They wear different clothes. She turned back. But every one of them buys the same promise. She rested one hand lightly against the glass. "That when they step onto one of our airplanes, they will be treated with dignity." The sentence echoed through the room. Victoria allowed several seconds to pass before speaking again. "When I accepted this position, people told me my biggest challenge would be fuel costs." She smiled faintly. Others said it would be competition. Some believed it would be technology. She slowly shook her head. They were wrong. She looked around the boardroom one final time. The greatest threat to any company is the moment people begin judging human beings before they know them. Her eyes returned to Captain Harris. Not with condemnation, but with hope. "I don't believe you are a bad man. I believe you made a harmful decision. And there is an important difference." Daniel felt emotion rise in his throat. Those words offered something he never expected. Not humiliation. Not public disgrace. But the opportunity to confront the truth without losing his humanity. If this moment touched your heart, remember this. The strongest people are not those who never make mistakes. They are the ones courageous enough to face them with honesty and change because of them. No one spoke after Victoria Carter finished. The room remained wrapped in a silence so complete that the distant sound of aircraft engines drifting through the glass windows seemed unusually clear. Captain Daniel Harris lowered his eyes to the conference table. For the first time in his distinguished career, he wished someone would interrupt the silence. Instead, it forced him to face something he had avoided for years. Himself. He slowly stood. The movement was hesitant, almost unfamiliar for a man whose confidence had defined every room he entered. He looked toward Victoria, then toward the board members. Finally, at Emma Collins. "I've spent 25 years believing experience made me a better judge of people." His voice was steady, but softer than anyone in the room had ever heard. "This morning, I learned that experience without humility can become blindness." No one interrupted. Daniel swallowed before continuing. "When I looked at Ms. Carter, I didn't see a passenger. I saw someone who didn't fit the picture I had already created in my mind." His words hung heavily in the air. "I never verified my assumption. I never gave her the opportunity to simply be who she was." He turned completely toward Victoria. "For that?" He paused, emotion briefly catching in his throat. "I am deeply sorry." The apology was not polished. It was not prepared by lawyers or public relations advisors. It came from a man confronting the truth of his own actions. Victoria held his gaze. She could see the weight he carried. Not fear of losing his position. Not embarrassment before the board. Something deeper. Regret. Real regret. She slowly rose from her chair. Every eye in the room followed her. When she reached Daniel, she stopped only a few feet away. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, Victoria offered a gentle smile. "Captain Harris, you cannot change what happened this morning." Daniel nodded quietly. "I know, but you can decide what happens because of it." The room remained silent. Victoria continued. "When I was a little girl, my father worked long nights repairing airplanes. He often came home exhausted. Sometimes people overlooked him because of the uniform he wore." She smiled at the memory. "But he never allowed bitterness to become part of his character. He taught me something I've carried my entire life." She looked directly into Daniel's eyes. He said, "Never let another person's mistake decide the kind of person you become." The words settled gently across the room. Victoria extended her hand. "I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in building an airline where no passenger leaves feeling invisible." Daniel stared at her hand for a long moment. Then he accepted it. His handshake was firm, but his eyes revealed something they never had before. Gratitude. Not because he had escaped consequences. Because someone had chosen restoration instead of humiliation. Around the table, several board members exchanged emotional glances. Emma felt tears gathering in her eyes. She realized she wasn't witnessing the end of a disciplinary meeting. She was witnessing the beginning of a different kind of leadership. Victoria turned toward everyone. "This isn't only Captain Harris's lesson." She looked around the room. "It's mine. It's yours. It's every leader's. If people are afraid to question our assumptions, then eventually our assumptions become our culture." The chairman slowly nodded. I couldn't agree more. Victoria smiled. Beginning today, SkyBridge Airways will introduce a new leadership initiative. Every executive, including me, will regularly travel anonymously. We will experience our airline exactly as our customers do. No exceptions. The board unanimously agreed. Emma felt hope replacing the tension that had filled the room only minutes earlier. This company wasn't pretending the mistake never happened. It was choosing to learn from it. Victoria looked once more toward Captain Harris. I would like you to help lead this program. Daniel looked stunned. After what happened? She nodded. Especially after what happened. The people who understand failure honestly are often the people most capable of preventing it. For several seconds, Daniel couldn't speak. Finally, he managed a quiet answer. I won't waste the opportunity. Victoria smiled warmly. I know. Outside the conference room, another SkyBridge aircraft lifted gracefully into the afternoon sky. Inside, something even more important had begun to rise. Not authority, not reputation, but trust. If this moment touched your heart, remember this. Forgiveness does not erase the past. It gives people the courage to build a better future. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving someone wrong, but helping them become better. ***. 6 months later, SkyBridge Airways had become a different company. The changes were not announced with flashy advertising campaigns or dramatic television commercials. There were no giant billboards promising a new era, no carefully scripted slogans designed by marketing agencies. Instead, the transformation revealed itself in quieter ways. Gate agents spent a little more time listening before answering. Flight attendants introduced themselves with genuine warmth rather than routine efficiency. Managers regularly left their offices to observe daily operations alongside frontline employees. Executives flew anonymously every month, experiencing delayed flights, crowded terminals, missed connections, and ordinary conversations exactly as passengers did. It became known internally as the Passenger Perspective Program. Its purpose was simple. Never allow authority to become distance. The initiative quickly spread throughout the company. Employees no longer feared respectfully questioning decisions that didn't feel right. Verification replaced assumption. Curiosity replaced certainty. Respect became more than a value printed in an employee handbook. It became a daily habit. Captain Daniel Harris remained with SkyBridge Airways. Some people had expected him to retire early after the incident. Others assumed he would quietly transfer to another airline. Instead, he chose something far more difficult. He stayed, not to defend his reputation, but to rebuild trust. Every class of newly hired pilots now included one presentation that Daniel insisted on delivering himself. He never showed awards. He never displayed photographs of successful emergency landings. Instead, he held up a single laminated boarding pass. Seat 2A. The same boarding pass Victoria Carter had placed on the conference table months earlier. He would look at the room full of young pilots and say, "The greatest mistake of my career wasn't made in the sky. It happened while an airplane was still parked at the gate." He never hid the truth. He explained how confidence had quietly become assumption, how assumption had become judgment, and how judgment had nearly cost him something far greater than a career: his integrity. The room always fell silent, not because the story was dramatic, but because it was honest. Emma Collins noticed the difference every time she worked another flight with Captain Harris. He greeted every passenger personally. He asked questions before making decisions. He listened. One afternoon, a young mechanic boarded in worn work clothes after receiving a last-minute upgrade. Years earlier, Daniel might have questioned the assignment. Instead, he smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard. We're glad you're here." Emma caught his eye as the passenger walked past. Daniel simply smiled back. No words were necessary. Both of them understood. Growth often appeared in the smallest moments. Victoria Carter continued leading SkyBridge with the same quiet humility that had defined her long before becoming CEO. She still traveled anonymously whenever possible. She still carried the same weathered leather tote. She still held doors open for strangers in airport terminals. Whenever journalists asked about the remarkable turnaround of SkyBridge Airways, they expected detailed discussions about financial strategy or operational efficiency. Victoria usually answered with something much simpler. Airplanes don't build trust. People do. Those 5 words eventually appeared on a small plaque inside every SkyBridge employee training center. Late one evening, after another successful flight, Captain Harris stood alone beside the terminal windows. Outside, the runway lights stretched into the darkness like endless ribbons of gold. Aircraft continued arriving. Families reunited. Children laughed as they ran toward waiting grandparents. Business travelers hurried home. Vacationers embraced loved ones. Thousands of different stories. Thousands of different lives. He realized something his younger self had never fully understood. Every passenger carried dreams invisible to everyone else, just as Victoria's father had once taught her. Daniel smiled quietly, not because he had become perfect, but because he had learned that real leadership begins the moment we choose to see people before we judge them. Across the terminal, Victoria walked toward another departure gate, unnoticed among the evening crowd. She glanced once through the glass. Their eyes met for only a brief second. Daniel placed a hand over his heart. Victoria answered with a small nod. Nothing more. No applause. No speeches. Only 2 people sharing a silent understanding. Outside, another SkyBridge aircraft rose into the night sky, its lights disappearing into the stars. And for every passenger aboard, the journey now began with something more important than a ticket. It began with dignity. The end.